If you're somebody thinking about your next pivot, maybe you feel trapped, maybe you feel like you can't make that next move, we got the perfect guest for you today. Joanne Lipman joins us. She's an award-winning journalist, served as editor-in-chief, as I mentioned earlier, of a little brand called USA Today, the USA Today Network, a Condé Nast portfolio, and the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Journal. Those organizations won 6 Pulitzers while she was in charge. She's been an on-air CNBC contributor, Yale University journalism lecturer, but now, of course, she's with us in Mom's Basement today. And joining us, I'm so happy she's here. Joanne Lipman is here. How are you?
I'm good, Joe. I'm really happy to be with you.
Well, I'm super happy. I can't wait to dive into this topic, mostly because as I was reading this work, none of it to me was, well, let's put it this way. It's intuitive. After I read your book, I went, wow, this all makes sense, but it wasn't the way I thought it was. So let's start actually where you begin. You have this Don Draper character that you're going to meet as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, right? He's this advertising guy. You show up early in the morning. Can you tell us the story of this man that you begin this work with?
Sure. So this is when I was a very young reporter. I actually started my career at the Wall Street Journal. I started as an intern, and then they hired me as a reporter. So I was a kid, and I was covering advertising. And at the time, this was the height of the burger wars. I am dating myself. We're talking like late 80s, height of the burger wars. And I had to...
Where's the beef?
So I had to go interview the guy who ran the Burger King campaign at J. Walter Thompson. And I go and I show up, and it's super early in the morning, and I'm dragging my feet. And he's like, oh, I've been up for hours already, this guy says. And he says, because what I really want to be, he's an ad executive. He says, what I really want to be is a writer. I want to be a novelist. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you and everybody else, buddy, right?
Right.
And he says, I got a book published. And he hands me across the desk, he hands me this book, which I didn't even glance at. I stuck it in my bag. I interviewed him, got my work done, went back. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, I'm on an airplane trip somewhere, stuck in coach in the middle seat there, as one does. And I pull this book out and start reading it. And honestly, I don't remember the details. I remembered it was about some guys trying to blow up Wall Street or something. And so actually, when I was writing my current book, I went back to look at the reviews. And Kirkus, which does book reviews, called this book, and I am quoting, abysmal, deserves drowning. And so clearly, I was thinking, this guy, good thing he has a day job, right?
Right. Did you like it, by the way? Did you like it while you were reading it?
I remember thinking that it was somewhat unsophisticated about, because I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and this was supposedly about Wall Street, and it just seemed not that sophisticated. That's
shallow.
I don't remember much about the plot. I remember thinking it was a good thing this guy has a day job. So fast forward, I want to say maybe 10 years later, I've moved on to a different beat. So, I'm not in touch with this guy anymore. And suddenly I see him on television on an ad, and he's holding up his latest book called Along Came a Spider. And he says, hi, I'm James Patterson. And that was my ad guy, Jim Patterson, who is now one of actually the most successful author of of all time in the United States. I mean, he is a multi-millionaire, if not a billionaire. He's written hundreds of best-selling books. He is unparalleled in terms of his success. But what's so fascinating is that I went back to him when I started the book Next, because it's the power of reinvention in life and work. And I thought, okay, I've never seen a reinvention like that one. What can we learn from that? So I got back in touch with him, and I asked him if he would just walk me through what happened between when I first met him years ago and today. How did he get from there to here, right? And he did, and it's an amazing story. It's an amazing story because there really are lessons for all of us in what he went through. We're not all going to turn into him. No promises there. But the steps that he went through, and the thought process he went through, and even, the insecurity that he went through is very, very common across any kind of reinvention, if you're thinking of pivoting in your career or your life.
The thing that struck me immediately was when you met him, you talk about how he'd already had a career. He was already known. He was on these big campaigns, Joanne. So he didn't do it. You know, they say a lot of change happens because of perspiration or desperation, right?
Right.
He didn't, quote, need to change. And a lot of times when I meet people and they talk about their career, their life, they're like, well, I'm too far along in this, so I guess I'll just keep going. But you really prove with Patterson out of the gate here that you can change whenever you want to.
You can. So for the book Next, I interviewed people from their 20s to their 90s. And change is not attached to any age. And in fact, so Jim Patterson, going back to his story, he actually did not quit the ad agency business until he was almost 50 years old. And actually, by that time, he had written close to a dozen books. And the last few he had finally kind of figured out. You know, the one that I read, he told me he actually ended up rewriting and re-releasing. I think it got much better reviews and bigger sales.
Maybe slightly.
But he had told me he really didn't kind of figure out his voice until he had written almost 10 books already. All while he was still at the ad agency. And he said, he really did want to be a writer, but, he had this career. And he, like many of us, he did not grow up well off or, he did not come from a fancy family. He came from a very, very middle-class family. And he said his dad always told him, you got to get a job and you have to have an earning and a salary. And he didn't think that being a writer with a capital W was a thing that he could actually be. It took him decades to get there.
And it's funny because a mentor of mine, when I was with American Express, had this wonderful speech he gave one day, Joanne, which was, he called it The Power of Being Five, about how when we were 5 years old, we wanted to be a firefighter, we wanted to be a president, we wanted to be an astronaut. And then we get into our 40s and we're hoping for a 3% cost of living raise. And maybe, we do a little addition on the house. Our goals get smaller and you go right there next. You talk about one of my favorite characters ever and one of your favorite, Harriet the Spy.
Yes.
I love Harriet the Spy. You wanted to be Harriet the Spy when you were young.
Yes. Harriet the Spy changed my life. And by the way, though, I just to your initial point there, I have to say 1,000% I agree with you about, and I talk about this in Next, how when we're children, we have this ability to imagine ourselves from one thing to the next, and we can think about one thing, and we don't feel bad about ourselves if we decide, I don't want to be an archaeologist anymore. Now I want to be a spy, which was actually me.
There's no guilt. There's no guilt attached to it.
There's no self-effacement. There's none of this beating ourselves up, flagellating ourselves. None of this, right? We have this ability, and what I wanted to do with Next is bring us back to that. Bring us back to when we're 5, and can do that, but with real strategies that will get us there. But just to talk about Harriet the Spy for just one moment, because, oh my gosh, this is one of my great regrets in life that I never got to meet the author, Louise Fitzhugh. But anyway, Harriet the Spy, as you know, is an 11-year-old spy. She's a kid, and she spies on her neighbors and her friends, and she writes it all down in a book, in a composition notebook. And I read it first when I was 7, and I asked my mom to get me a composition notebook like Harriet the Spy had. And through the next, all through elementary school, all the way up till probably 6th or 7th grade, I was never without one of these notebooks, spying on my older sisters and their boyfriends and my neighbors, So I wanted to be a spy, and I wrote so much. And then I think it was around 6th or 7th grade when I realized that there was actually a career that I could follow where you do almost exactly that, and it's called journalism. And I mean, I wanted to be a writer of some sort. And I loved asking questions. So I didn't actually like the stealth spying, but I had the curiosity. I just wanted anybody I met, I wanted to know everything about them. And I took notes. And that led me to my career in journalism.
That's funny. Maybe that's me as podcaster as well. My Harriet the Spy. thing, because I love the fact that I talked to you today. I talked to, you talk to writers, movie directors, all over the place. It's something different all the time, and feeds that curiosity that I have. I remember Harriet in that dumbwaiter, and I was always sure she was going to get caught.
Me too. Me too. Also, when I was a kid, I didn't know what a dumbwaiter was, so it took me quite a while to figure out what was going on in those scenes.
Right. It's not a horrible waiter, right? It isn't.
Right.
It's something totally different. We think, though, that, okay, I'm going to make this change if we do have an idea. And I want to talk about where these ideas come from, because you really dive into this, because they don't come from where we think they come from. They also don't, and they don't appear the way we think that they're going to appear. But you talk about how we focus on the wrong things, though, Joanne. Talk about guilt and failure and not wanting to fail. And we think this change is going to be easy. And you set us straight at the beginning that for 99.9% of us, this isn't going to be easy. You talk about Sarah Blakely changing, Harrison Ford changing, like these changes. We hear some of these stories and we think, okay, they magically all of a sudden did something different. It doesn't usually work like that.
100%. So this is one of the big myths that we explode in the book next. And you hit it on the head about this idea of overnight success. And what I call it the Cinderella effect, right? It's the Cinderella myth. So we are brought up on this from birth, right? With the fairy tales, and the frog turns into the prince. And by the time we're adolescents, we got Spider-Man and Superman who change instantly. And then we get to be grown-ups and we're watching reality TV with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or American Idol.
Or the Property Brothers redo the house in half an hour.
Yeah,
and it's gorgeous.
Exactly. At the end of the segment, boom, your house is over. Yeah, there you go. And so we are brought up with this myth, and it's really damaging that these things happen overnight. And if it doesn't happen overnight for us, there's something wrong with us. And it makes us all feel terrible, like everybody else seems to be able to do this transformation. What's my problem? What's wrong with me? And what I realized, and the myth that I explode in the book next, is that myth is completely wrong. That is absolutely wrong. That there is, I've plot out what I call the reinvention roadmap, and there's basically 4 steps which we can walk through. But I want to focus on the second step, which we call the struggle, which is in between, right? When you start in one place, you end up in the other, but there is a big, messy struggle in the middle where you've kind of have left behind where you were, but you haven't figured out where you're going. And the thing is that when you're going through it, it's really uncomfortable. When we tell these stories, these big success stories, we tend to gloss right over it. But in fact, it happens to everyone. And not only that, it's really important. It's an incredibly important part of the process. You can't flip a switch and go from one thing to another. You have to go through this very uncomfortable middle period that we don't like to talk about. But it's also really important, and it should make you feel better when you're going through it, that you're actually doing really important work. Even if you think you're standing still, you're actually moving forward.
You had, to your point about the struggle is a good thing, a great analogy that comes from a guy named, I hope I get this right, Dashin Wang, Northwestern University computational social scientist. And it's an ice cube analogy. I don't know if you remember that story, Joanne, but if you can, I think this is a great way to think about the struggle.
Yes. This was so great. He studies failure. He's a computational scientist, data scientist who studies failure. And what he said is very often when we fail, it's because we actually stop too soon, right? That in that struggle period, we'd like throw up our hands and just like walk away. And his analogy is this ice cube. So he said, your job is to melt an ice cube. And you walk into the room and it's 28 degrees in the room. And so you say, okay, I'm going to turn up the temperature to 29. And it still doesn't melt. And then you turn it to 30, it doesn't melt. 31, it doesn't melt. And you're like, I give up. I walk away, right? And if you had turned it up one more degree, there you go, right? You would have
change
happens, but you just kind of get frustrated and walk away. And too often that is what happens to us. Like we're in this feeling of struggle and we say, I just can't do it. And we throw up our hands. What Dashin Wang found was really interesting is he found that what he calls successful failures are those where it's not working, but rather than just walking away or throwing up our hands, which we are all tempted to do, what you do is you make iterative changes. And as he said, it's important to fail fast, but that fail fast kind of mantra in Silicon Valley has been sort of misconstrued, right? It's like they're throwing all kinds of things against the wall to see what sticks, and then they fail, they throw it out, they try something else. His point is quite different. It's you want to fail fast, as in figure out what's not working, but then you make a tiny tweak. And then if that doesn't work, another tweak, and then another tweak. And it's iterative changes. And he did this really, I think it was him who did this very interesting study. I know there was a study done that looked at, both sort of venture capitalists like founded new companies, but also looked at like terrorist attacks. I mean, just looked at a variety of different kinds of efforts, of which early ones were failures and then they succeeded later. And it was always making these iterative changes. So that's something to really keep in mind during the struggle. I'd love to talk about...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about where the struggle fits in, though, in this reinvention roadmap, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, I did want to talk about that because your 4 steps are search, then struggle, then stop, and solution. And I was actually going to go back to search. But before I do that, just to help put a point on this, too, for people, this idea of iterative change, about making these little tweaks, I don't know. When I read that, Joanne, it gave me much more confidence that I can get it wrong. It's okay to get it wrong.
Yes.
It's fine. If I feel like I'm on the path, like I can make these little tweaks. And I embrace the process. Everybody falls in love with the outcome. And you talk a lot of, you've got another story here, an Olympic skater named Nathan Chen.
Yeah.
And Nathan Chen talks about this a little bit. And it's funny, we just had Olympian Kara Goucher on the show.
Awesome.
And Kara talked about the same thing Nathan does in your book, which is whenever she thought about winning, about the pressure and about Olympics or world records or whatever, she fell off a cliff and she was horrible. But whenever she thought about her gait and her speed and her workouts and the tweak, things went much, much better. And just that approach to me just seems healthier.
That is so much healthier, right? And Nathan Chen talks about the same thing about the previous Olympic, the most recent Olympics where he won the gold. It was all about him focusing on the process. And he said the previous Olympics where he had been favored, but he ended up having a relatively poor performance, was because everybody, and including him, his whole headspace was that he had to win the gold. And it was about the end as opposed to about the process. And the process is where all the work happens. That's what it's all about. And you've got to kind of be fully there in the process and not get distracted by the shiny thing.
Right now.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think about, Joanne, as I was reading and as I'm listening to you, just also being present in the moment, and how much more satisfying is that to be present in the moment?
Yes.
But for you, so this is step number 2. Step number 1, though, is search. And you have this explosive idea, at least it was explosive to me, that we think, to your point that you said earlier, that we have this plan and we're going to work backwards. And we talk about a lot here, begin with the end in mind. But you talk about the power of just your gut and your gut reaction. And I can't tell you, Joanne, how many times I've told people, like, don't trust your gut. But in this process about reinvention, trusting your gut might be the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the reinvention roadmap that I talked about, right, it's search, struggle, stop, solution. The first step is this search. And the search piece of it is so cool because so many of the people I talk to, what search is, it's when you're collecting information. But the fascinating thing I found in all of the research and in the interviews I did is the search begins before you know it began. It's you're starting to collect this information. You're sucking up kind of different, pieces of information that might seem unrelated. You might then, you have a hobby. You might have a random interest. You might have a side hustle. But you're collecting information. And almost everybody embarks on this transformation before they realize it. So that's the search piece of it. And then the search piece then ultimately goes to the struggle when you start to say, you know what, you start to disconnect from where you were before. And then you move into this struggle because you haven't quite figured out where you're going, but you know that you're sort of disconnecting yourself from where you started. And this is where gut comes in as well. I have a whole chapter on how do you know you should even start to embark on this transformation, right? Whether it's switching careers or even making like a big change in your life, how do you know? And I did a lot of research into gut feeling. And it turns out that in the case particularly of these sorts of reinventions, you should listen to your gut. And I know the advice is don't listen to your gut. But it turns out that your gut actually isn't just sort of a feeling that comes out of nowhere. That your gut, when it works, it's because you have all sorts of information that you got in this search stage that you don't even realize you've accumulated so much knowledge, but you haven't consciously put all of that knowledge together. But your gut, like your brain and your body, they know that you've got all this knowledge. And that's the signal they're sending you, is that gut feeling that this is the right thing to do. And there's a ton of research on this. There's even research on like CFOs and top executives who, when they have to make major financial decisions, very often they'll collect all the data, and they have voluminous amounts of data, and then they discard the data to make the actual decision. And those who do this successfully, they are successful because they're using their gut, but their gut is actually accumulated expertise. It's not from nowhere. It actually comes from something.
Yeah, you draw the line here that there's a good gut decision and a bad gut decision. A bad gut decision is when, I believe, I'm paraphrasing, when you truly don't know anything about the subject and your gut just kind of goes, I think I'm going to do this with no information. But an educated gut, one where you've been in the trench, you know this area inside out, that gut decision is probably better. Is that it?
You articulated that exactly right. The analogy that I really like is expert chess players. So if you've ever watched an expert chess player, they can play 25 people at once, and they can do it like boom, 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 right? And they don't have to think about it. And the reason that they can do that is because they have the accumulated knowledge of every single chess move in their head. They don't have to analyze each board that they go to. They can just know, and that's their gut speaking. But their gut is informed by their hours and hours of play and all of the thousands, tens of thousands of moves and plays that they already have stored in their brain. So they don't have to consciously think about it.
I see those people do that, and I just think, how do you have that all in your, just amazes me.
But you have that in your brain about whatever topic you're an expert in. You just don't realize it, right? You don't have to call on it consciously.
People that know me, Joanne, know that you are vastly overestimating me. Vastly overestimating me.
Oh, don't underestimate yourself.
I love the idea of, we call it here, embrace the suck, about this, that the struggle is real and sometimes it stinks. But that third step here about stop, about how there's this natural pause. And I thought about this as I was reading, that there is this period where you've either given up or you've stopped your conscious brain from thinking about it. And that's when the answer appears. I never get my good answers. And you hear this from everybody, I'm sure, Joanne. I get my best answers when I'm out on my walk.
Yep.
And I'm listening to something else, or I'm in the shower, right? Everybody says my great idea comes in the shower. But these ideas happen when you don't think they're going to happen. Right.
And the stop is so important. That's the third step. So you're struggling. The stop happens. It could be something that you bring on yourself. So it could be that you quit your job and you stop. Or it could be something just like, I give up, I can't figure this out, or I'm distracting myself. And you go for your walk, or you go to sleep and you wake up in the middle of the night, or you're in the shower. And it could be that sort of thing. The stop could also be something that happens to you. So several of the people who I interviewed had these big career change aha moments when they, one person was diagnosed with cancer, and luckily he recovered, but like that made him stop in his tracks. For a woman who I spoke to, she had been a stay-at-home mom, and it was when her oldest child went back to college and suddenly her house is different. Like it's something that happens to you. Or by the way, a pandemic stopped all of us in our tracks. And I think that wouldn't happen. So the pandemic actually was the impetus for the book. It was the inspiration for me to write the book in the first place, is because usually that big transformative moment for you, that life-changing aha moment, usually any of these kinds of big moments happen to you very individually, and it might be prompted by, something great, like you get married, or something tragic, like, you're wiped out by a hurricane, or there's a divorce or death in the family. But what happened with the pandemic is this stop moment happened to all of us all at once, all at the same time. And what happened was it tore all of us out of our routines. And that's why that is what led to what we saw with the Great Resignation, with people like reprioritizing their lives and saying, am I in the right career? Is this the right life for me? And it's why, if you look at the research, during the pandemic, the majority of people who quit their jobs or were unemployed were looking in different fields. They were actually considering changing careers altogether. But what happens in the stop, the reason why this is important is because what happens, so you had your search where you're collecting information, you had your struggle where you're not quite sure what is going on. What the stop does is it stops you in your tracks, and it allows all of that information that had been floating around in your brain to coalesce. And that coalescing, and literally, by the way, neuroscientists in a laboratory can see when that happens. They can see when you have an aha moment. They can see there's a part of your brain that like lights up. It is literally the spark of insight. But you need to have that moment in order for all of those ideas to come together into the moment that you can figure out, okay, this is where I'm going. That is what leads to the transformation.
The first half of your book is a lot, and even more, about what we've talked about today and how this works much differently than you think that it does. The second half is tactics. And obviously we're coming to the end of our time together, so we can't go through all of them, but I do want to talk about one, because, a lot of people, especially with their financial plan, Joanne, they talk about how, maybe I want to be a digital nomad, or maybe I want to take a sabbatical, or maybe I want to change careers. Maybe I want to retire early to this other place. You have this idea, and it's funny. I didn't even make a note of it, so I might have the name wrong, but you basically say something about like walk before you walk. Just go wander, go. I felt like you are saying a great tactic is kind of to test drive. Is that what you're getting at? Like test drive some of the stuff ahead of time so you're able to coalesce your thinking better?
Yes. So I call it move before you move. So
move before you. I was so close.
Super close. So move before you move means that you try things out. So there's a concept in psychology called possible selves. So a first step is to imagine what you might be, what you could be, and you're thinking about it, but it's not enough to think about it. You have to take some action. And so you move before you move, as in you experiment, or you have a hobby, side hustle, whatever, but you take action. You don't just think about what you might want. You take action on it. And the one other thing I would love to mention before we close also, though, is the big myth that I feel like this book next explodes this myth. And the myth is, and I referenced it a little bit earlier, but this Cinderella myth, which is this myth that it happens overnight, and it doesn't, right? Most people who I interviewed, it takes time. There is this sort of struggle, and they don't know where they're going to end up. That's the other thing. There's the other myth is that you absolutely have to know where you're going. And so many of the people I interviewed, all of the steps that they took, this moving before you move, it led them to the goal, but they didn't know that that's where they were going to end up. And I think that's really important too, because, there are certain things that it makes a lot of sense. If you know that you want to be a doctor, you know all the steps you have to take to get there. And definitely you need to have a plan. But for so many of the people I met who reinvented their careers or their lives in some way, it was the steps they took along the way that led them there. And they didn't know where they were going to end up. And they ended up in a much more gratifying place than they thought that they were going. And so it's so important to have that open mind and to let your interests and your body and your knowledge lead you there.
It reminds me so much of that Tolkien quote that what all who wander are not lost.
Yeah.
You know, the book is next, The Power of Reinvention in Life and Work. It's available everywhere yesterday, everyone. And we barely touched on the tactics. There are so many tactics if you're looking to reinvent any piece of your life. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you one thing on a totally unrelated topic,
Sure.
Joanne, before we let you go, which is we all imagine a newspaper newsroom as this high-flying place and the stress, and the paper's got to go to print, right? Back in the day, the paper just had to go to print, or we got to get it out there. I'm wondering if there's one story you can tell our stackers about a time when there was a story and maybe you're waiting on a source or you're waiting on a thing and it was this big deal and you weren't sure if you had it or you didn't have it. You have to have 90 of these, I would think.
I got more than 90. How much time do you got?
You've got I would think you've got high blood pressure is what you probably have.
You got to kind of be able to thrive on a deadline, and you have to really appreciate the adrenaline. And there is nothing like the adrenaline of a newsroom when you are up against deadline. I wrote a daily column for quite a number of years when I was at the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And, you know, you were up against it every single day. You had to figure out what you're writing about, et cetera. But also, you know, when you have a giant breaking news story, you know, also when you have an election that goes down to the wire, you know, when Trump was first elected, I was running USA Today, and we were there all night because, you know, everybody expected Hillary Clinton to win. And so you're there with your whiteboard at midnight, erasing all of the ideas for stories you had, and writing in all the new stories and on the phones and rounding up reporters from all over the country to do their different pieces and eating a lot of cold pizza. Every journalist will tell you that we all feast on cold pizza. That is an election night special.
Well, that particular night, I would imagine it's not just you and a few people. I would imagine everybody is on high alert. Everybody's on high alert.
Everybody, and you're writing and rewriting stories in real time, and it's all going out, and it's actually very, very exciting when big news is breaking, and you do have quite the adrenaline rush. So you have to have a certain kind of, I guess, personality to thrive on that. But pretty much everybody in a newsroom does. It's very different now because since the pandemic, so many people are working remotely, and it's unfortunate actually, because I do love the energy. There's nothing like the energy of a newsroom. It's awesome.
The buzz. And I'm thinking that's going to help us. I know that there's big problems now in office land, right? I mean, we just saw it at Google that they're changing it, but changing these office spaces to when we're together, keeping us together for that buzz, I think is super important.
I agree.
By the way, talk about the power of reinvention. Reinventing yourself, Joanne, like 8 times during one evening might be a little tough. Yeah, thanks for hanging out with us and helping stackers reinvent themselves. I really appreciate it.
Sure, Joe. It's been a pleasure. This is a really great conversation, and good luck to all the stackers out there.